About that, so I just want to make sure that the record button has been pressed.
Yes, I'm gonna just do that now. Yep.
Perfect. And we can go ahead and get started. So the title of my talk today is Virtue and Vexation in VR, Confronting Wicked Problems with Autistic Stakeholders. And I do kind of intentionally use with instead of for autistic stakeholders, and I'll touch on that. So my name's Matthew Schmidt. I'm an associate professor of educational technology at the University of Florida. And if you want to get in touch with me, there's a couple of links and details on here. And of course, we can use the various chat features and so on to stay in contact if you'd like to learn more, share resources, or what have you. And I'm also happy to share this slideshow with everyone after the fact. So who am I? My research focuses on the design, development, and implementation of advanced technology interventions. And specifically, I evaluate the impact of the interventions that we develop in my studio, specifically focusing on people with disabilities and their parents, caregivers, support networks, and so on. And within this frame, I've been doing research on virtual reality and autism since 2008. And I've developed a number of interventions within that frame. And if we have time today, I'll show a couple of things that I'm working on right now. So on that note, why don't we jump right in, and I'll just tell you a little bit about this idea of virtues and vexations. So in some ways, I feel like the research on autism in VR has ended up at a crossroads, and we as a field need to begin to think about ways to productively move this research forward in a way that diverges from what we've been doing in the past. And in order to do that, I think that we need to adopt kind of a reflective lens where we think about what we've done that is virtuous and what VR can do that is virtuous, but we also need to think critically about what are the things that are bothering us, what are the things that are annoying us, what are problems with our research, how can we address those fundamental issues in a way that's going to be more productive, it's going to kind of move us to the next step. So that's kind of the framework that I want to situate this talk within. And in some ways, perhaps this is a serendipitous way to start the conference, and that perhaps it'll provide a lens for some of our conversations moving forward. So I went online, I grabbed a couple of definitions from the free dictionary, where virtue is any admirable quality or attribute, or the quality of doing what's right and avoiding what is wrong, and a vexation is something that both causes annoyance and the state of mind that results from being annoyed. I think you guys will get the sense that I'm a little bit annoyed with the state of the research right now and where we're at. But first, why don't we jump into the virtues that I see in the area of VR. So the first thing is that, since like 1996, we've been saying that virtual reality is a promising technology for providing training and support and therapy for people with autism. And there are a number of reasons why. We understand that virtual environments are safe, they're completely controllable. Training in virtual reality is very predictable, and virtual environments can be adapted and customized based on user behaviors and preferences. All these are very powerful when we're working with a neurodiverse population. And on that note, there's this notion that people with autism kind of have a natural affinity to virtual reality, or that it has an autism compatibility. And there's a good deal of research on that. And I would point you to the work that Sarah Parsons and Sue Cobb did in 2011, where they looked at the state of the art of virtual reality at that time. Another virtue is the idea that what is learned in virtual reality can generalize to the real world, and that can be knowledge, skills, attitudes, and so on. And this is largely attributed to the realism of virtual reality and the idea that if you're able to replicate the real world in virtual reality with enough fidelity, that the way people behave in the real world is how they will behave in VR, and then, conversely, that will then transfer back into the real world. And there's a lot of things that allow that to happen, such as the realism of the virtual environment, and that would be the behavioral realism, the photographic realism, as well as the psychological sense of presence or being there, both cognitively, socially, spatially, and the sense of immersion that the various hardware components provide. And this is really important because generalization is an issue across all areas of autism research, not just virtual reality research. And so it's really an area that's worth investigating further. In addition, virtual reality is believed to increase access to services. That is, by using, for example, multi-user virtual environments, you're able to reach geographically distant users using, for example, telemedicine techniques. And the idea is that this can potentially reduce provider or caregiver burden. It can reduce cost, travel, complexity, and so on. And importantly, it can also improve the fidelity of implementation of a variety of different interventions. So here I've got an example of an environment that was developed by Justine Cassell and her group at Northwestern University. And this is essentially a conversational agent where a child plays with the dollhouse and has a conversation with the avatar in the background. And because this avatar is going to behave in the same way every single time, respond in the same way predictably, the implementation fidelity is really quite high because it's very highly scripted. So that's something that's definitely a benefit in terms of VR. And then, of course, for us as researchers, VR is seen as being a really exciting medium because it's infinitely plastic. We can do so many things with virtual reality that we may not be able to do in the real world. For example, we can adjust the input stimuli so that the environment, for example, the noises in the environment are softer or louder, or the colors are muted or brighter, the brightness is higher or lower. And we can create more cartoon-looking avatars, more realistic-looking avatars, environments, and so on. These are just a few examples of how we're able to manipulate these environments with great plasticity. We're also able to manipulate time in these environments where we can actually pause the action, take a step back and take a look at what's happening, and then start the action again. Or we can rewind it, we can replay it. There's some really interesting things that can happen there. We can use gamification techniques or even games themselves to increase motivation and engagement and interest. A lot we can do. And in particular, these virtual environments are seen as very promising when you're in a DICE situation, or I like to call it a dicey situation. So this is some work that Jeremy Valenson has done, and he's kind of one of the pioneers of virtual reality and psychology. And he says, virtual reality is really attractive when you're looking at situations that are dangerous, impossible, counterintuitive, or expensive. And I think that any of us who've worked in autism interventions or autism education and so on can probably relate to many different examples that might be dicey, right? And finally, the technology itself is really exciting because it has a number of affordances that have been identified as being potentially useful when working with people with autism. And here I just have a smattering of them from an article that was put out by Boz-Kiekli and colleagues a couple years ago. And I won't go into them in depth. This is just kind of a screenshot from some work that I'm doing where I'm trying to map needs and abilities of people with autism to technology affordances. But as you can see, there are many affordances that have been associated with the technology itself. So on that note, we can see there are many virtues of virtual reality that we can certainly extol, but virtual reality is not without its vexations. And the research around virtual reality and autism is also not without its vexations. Just taking a quick look at the time, and we're doing pretty well. So in terms of vexations, and you might see some Simpsons references pop up here. I'm a Simpsons fan. There are three that are really important and really problematic, and that's that much of the research reflects an intrinsic bias or a number of intrinsic biases. The research is problematically methodologically limited, and there are a number of unsubstantiated assumptions that we use to justify the work that we do. And I'll go into those in the next following slides, but there's also other issues that kind of bug me that I'm going to talk about as well. Let's start with some of the biases. So the first, and this is something that hasn't really been touched on in the literature, but it's something that I, as an educational technologist, am particularly sensitive to, is that there is a rampant technological determinism that underscores nearly all of the work that has been done to date. And this is also referred to as technocentrism, which Seymour Papert kind of famously wrote about back in 1988. And the issue with this technological determinism or technocentrism is that all questions and all answers are kind of referred to the technology. And there seems to be this underlying belief that the technology itself has some sort of special capabilities or special properties that, by virtue of it being technology, will result in whatever kind of outcomes we're seeking. And I would say 3 to 4 decades of educational technology research have completely refuted this notion. And in fact, what we know is that technology alone very infrequently has any effect, unless it's actually kind of a negative effect by introducing an additional variable within an intervention. Instead, we need to think about technology from within broader activity systems where people, communities, rules, division of labor, and things of that nature are also going to influence the effectiveness and the outcomes of a given intervention. Another bias is that a great deal of the work reflects a medical model of disability, where researchers tend to take a view that autism is a condition that needs to be ameliorated so that people with autism can better attain a state of normalcy. And this is a position that has been contrasted with neurodiversity movements or social ecological models of disability that really kind of turn this notion on its head. But regardless, these medical models are pervasive in the literature. And associated with that, we see that a great deal of the literature reflects a positivist or a post-positivist worldview, in that the research is really trying to establish empirically or prove that virtual reality works. And I think that whole notion of trying to establish what works has kind of led us to the state that we're at, because trying to determine if technology alone is going to work is a bit of a fool's errand. And we know that in the field of educational technology. And you can take a look at, for example, the book Oversold and Underused, which showed that, schools, for example, buy massive amounts of technology investments, but those technology investments tend to have nearly no impact on educational outcomes. So those are some of the biases. Let's talk a little bit about some other issues, such as methodological limitations associated with the research. One that's often cited is that there are small numbers of participants, and this is something that is pervasive across autism research in general. And associated with that is a general lack of comparison groups. And when there are comparison groups, oftentimes they are neurotypical comparison groups. In addition to that, it's very difficult to find any studies that look at effectiveness longitudinally. So we don't see ongoing research agendas in this area. Instead, you'll see a study here, a study there, and we end up with kind of a patchwork of different studies without a common thread between them. And on top of that, although we would probably agree that autism is a very heterogeneous condition, the samples that we see in the research are often quite homogeneous. And by that, I mean, if I can characterize the research broadly, we see most research being performed on children and adolescents with a very high proportion of males, which is common. But also we see almost all the research being focused on level 1 autism, or what we might refer to as higher functioning autism. And that's problematic in that we're making generalizations to the entire autism spectrum based on a very small proportion of that spectrum. And kind of paradoxically, we also have very heterogeneous interventions in that interventions span a huge variety of hardware, software designs, and also the intervention focus themselves. So we have kind of, again, a patchwork of studies that look at very different aspects of intervention and therapy and training, and we try to generalize from that, and that's problematic. And then that takes us to our unfounded assumptions. And so this is where I might get into a little bit of hot water, but I'm trying to be a bit provocative here, folks. We state that virtual reality is effective for autism, but there is very weak support for this claim. We believe that virtual reality can promote transfer and generalization from the virtual world to the real world. And to date, I think there is one, maybe two studies that have established this with a level of methodological rigor that make them believable. There's this notion that virtual reality aligns with autistic characteristics, but there's been very little research that specifically attempts to align the affordances of technology with specific known characteristics of autism. So the statement that VR might align with autistic characteristics needs to be really broken down much farther. There's also the notion that VR can be cost effective, particularly related to providing services to people who, for example, are geographically distant. And I still haven't seen this bear out. And most of the research that's done is a bespoke VR system that uses very customized tools. It's implemented in a very narrow context, and after the research is done, where does the intervention go? Where does the software go? So there's no real longevity. The projects don't sustain, and we don't really see anyone approaching the research to practice gap, for example, with common off-the-shelf hardware or software. And as a result, there's a massive amount of research dollars that go into developing interventions, but are the outcomes actually cost effective? So I do question whether that is something that we can state. And then there's the idea that VR is safe, and this may harken back to the dicey situations that Bailenson alludes to. Obviously, if you want to do street crossing training, for example, doing it in a virtual environment is ostensibly safer than doing it in the real world. However, there's also this notion that VR in and of itself is safe and appropriate. And as we know, virtual reality can induce adverse effects such as cyber sickness. And there are many research studies that state that cyber sickness is a direction that we need to focus on with our future research. But there's very little research that actually specifically looks at cyber sickness in VR. So whether VR is indeed safe is still an open question. And so these assumptions that drive the justification for much of the research that we have really are lacking evidence. And so I often ask, where's the money? Show me the money, show me the evidence, substantiate the claims, and I'm not sure that we can do that yet. And as a result, I often feel that we might sound like this guy trying to sell you a used car, where we have a lot of promises and we talk a lot about the promise of virtual reality, but we don't necessarily have the data to back those promises up. So those are some of the things that annoy me, but they aren't all of them. I also have further vexations. For example, in the world of educational technology, much of our work is going to be grounded in theory, theories of change, for example. So I might use working memory or cognitive load theory in order to inform a design that is meant to specifically influence that aspect of cognition and then result in some sort of an outcome. And that's something that I just don't see in the research around VR and autism. In addition, in many ways, our field is a design field because interventions must be designed, and those interventions are designed based on a theory of change. And yet, there are very few research articles that report how they designed their interventions. And in fact, we finished up a systematic literature review where we specifically looked at this question of how people designed their environments, and it was disappointing because very, very few people actually report on their designs. A major problem in our field is that there's no standardized definition of what constitutes virtual reality. So we have people who are developing iPhone apps, and I kind of mocked something up over here to poke a little bit of fun. But iPhone apps that present 2D avatars as conversational agents, and this is claimed to be a manifestation of virtual reality. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have fully immersive cave implementations, and these are being kind of all lumped together. And I also have a screenshot here of 360-degree video-based virtual reality. And clearly, just from a very surface level, brief look, you can see that these technologies are wildly disparate, both in terms of interface as well as in terms of interaction, the affordances that these technologies provide. And yet, for some reason, much of the literature is going to kind of lump all of them into a standardized basket. In addition to that, and this is kind of my own bias, but I do a lot of work in learning experience design, and that's based on user-centered design and HCI and human-centered computing methods. And we don't see a lot of that happening in the work associated with VR and autism. And I'm going to talk about that on a slide a little bit later, but it sure does bug me. In terms of cyber sickness and adverse effects, we talk about it a lot in our research, but there is no systematic research around it. And our research is biased towards children and adolescents. There's really not a lot of research on adults, but it would seem that adults, and in particular transition-age adults, could benefit particularly from virtual reality. So I do question why we're not focusing on that population. Then there's the issue that many of the interventions that we have are not necessarily aligned with the priorities of the autism community. So in a structured literature review that Mesa Gracia and her colleagues put together, she noted that the majority of research is focused on social and emotional skills. That's a full 66% of the articles that were reviewed in that study. Now, let's contrast this with the research that Harris and colleagues just put out, where they surveyed people with autism on funding priorities and what they found to be important or not important. And as we can see from this, the three areas that were deemed to be most important in the autism community have to do with transition, lifespan issues, and health and well-being. None of those necessarily focus on social skills or emotional skills. And this is substantiated by a meta-analysis that hasn't been published yet, but the preprint is out by Karami and colleagues. And what you can see here is at the top in red and also on the right in red, SCS, that's socio-communicative skills. Underneath that in green is emotional regulation skills. And on the left-hand side, what we have is non-controlled, i.e. no control group studies, and on the right-hand side, we have controlled studies. What we can see on the left is that the social skills, emotional regulation, and down at the bottom, pure communication skills, those have weak to moderate effectiveness. Whereas when we take a look at the daily living skills, that's the DLS that I have highlighted in red, those actually have strong effects. And so you have to question, with so much focus on social skills and emotional skills, and yet these aren't areas that are necessarily valued by the autism community, and these aren't areas that are necessarily particularly effective in terms of our intervention design. We have to ask, are we focusing on the right thing, or are we barking up the wrong tree? So if we take a look, taken together at these issues with the fragmentary, unsystematic, and methodologically limited research that we have, the costs associated with VR, the technological complexity of designing and developing VR, and short technology life cycles. We look at the biases of technological centrism or technocentrism, research that's ontologically narrow, privileging intervention efficacy over other areas of research, a lack of design precedent, a lack of theory, and a relatively heterogeneous target population. We've got a really wicked problem. So the question then becomes, where do we go from here? But before we even get to that, I question, what if we're completely wrong about all of our assumptions to date? And to be honest, I don't actually think we're completely wrong. In fact, anyone who's worked in this area, there's something about VR that just fits. And when you use it with autistic populations, you see that there's something happening there. I'm just not sure that we've teased that out yet. But for the sake of argument, I'm going to present John Ioannidis's article, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. This is kind of a classic now. And he argues that issues such as bias, low statistical power, a low number of true hypotheses, and a lack of replication studies leads to researchers reporting results that are false. And in our field, we've mentioned the biases, the technocentrism, medical models, the positivist orientation, the issue with statistical power related to small n studies and no control groups. Our assumptions are as yet unfounded, and I can draw a parallel with true hypotheses and nearly no replication studies. So we've got some real issues. And it draws me to the question of, like, is this a Sisyphean task, right? The guy who was punished by the gods to roll the boulder up Mount Olympus, and then it would roll down and he would do that for eternity. Is that what we're doing? We've got a lack of definitive findings, which I see as a bit of an inconvenient truth. We have some of the fundamental assumptions of the research coming into question, such as Sarah Parsons' very convincing piece that she put out in 2016, where she questions the idea that by virtue of having strong realism in our environments, that we're going to promote generalization. These are serious weaknesses that we haven't addressed yet, but we continue to engage in research that reflects these same problems. And indeed, interest is increasing. We got one of the people here who's published on this and has shown that the interest in this area is just exploding. So where do we go from here? How can we fix this? And I don't know if I have the answer for how we can fix it, but I certainly know what we don't need to do. We don't need to do any more research to establish the promise of virtual reality, because we've been doing that for 25 years and we sound like a broken record. We don't need to say that virtual reality has promise anymore. We need to prove it. We need to spend our time doing that. We need to stop referring to this massive range of technologies and interventions as VR, and instead be much more intentional and detailed about how we describe our interventions and our designs. We also need to stop generalizing from a very small range of participants to a broader population, particularly with the heterogeneity that we know exists in the autism community. And we also need to stop expecting that technology alone is going to solve our problems. So how do we get out of this quandary? The first thing I think we need to do is start questioning assumptions. For example, many of the people who have done systematic literature reviews are going to point to the need for larger N studies with control groups. And I question, that's my timer. I'm going to have to speed it up here, guys. I question if randomized controlled trials is the way to increase rigor in this area, particularly when we have a research methodology single subject design that's been used for decades in this area, which is highly rigorous and very appropriate for low incidence disabilities. I also question if we shouldn't be doing more design-based research that utilizes iterative design and formative evaluation in order to improve our designs over time. We need to start questioning what the fundamental mechanisms of transfer and generalization are, because it's not technology alone. In fact, there's a whole body of literature that would suggest there are heuristics that we can use to intentionally promote transfer that are largely absent in our existing literature base. We also need to start thinking about the specifics of VR tools and which VR tools are going to be most appropriate within which context, for which users, with what level of necessary supports and so on. Again, it goes back to that idea of defining VR, but also being more intentional about what different types of VR can be useful. For example, video-based virtual reality, there's again a huge literature base on video modeling, for example, that could potentially inform design of 360 video virtual reality, and that's an area that remains largely unexplored. And another question is, what theories are guiding these implementations, other than if we use VR, we will get the kinds of outcomes that we want. We need to think a bit more about the psychology of what we're doing, and we need to look a bit more deeply at not only those theories, but how those theories inform our designs and how the evidence that we have in the field informs our designs. And I'd point you again to that Basquiat article from 2018, which is one of the only articles that specifically looks at evidence-informed design. Another thing that I would say we need to do is we need to stop asking the same questions, such as what works best, is it effective, what deficits can we address with VR? There's the assumption that VR is going to exacerbate social isolation. I say those are questions that are important, but we also need to ask questions such as, how can we make this work better? Not only is it effective, but is it efficient? Is it appealing? Is it appropriate? And does it meet stakeholder needs? And instead of focusing solely on deficits, maybe we can start asking what strengths VR can amplify, as well as what barriers VR can address to community inclusion, etc. And instead of thinking about VR as potentially exacerbating social isolation, perhaps VR can provide an avenue to promote social inclusion that otherwise might be lacking. And another piece, and again, this is a bit of my own bias, but I think we really need to involve our users from a learning experience design perspective, from a user experience design perspective, from human-centered computing perspectives, but also from perspectives that would suggest this is the way we need to go just in general when working with the autistic community. And that's because most of the work that's been done in this field, most of the research that we see, has been designed and implemented by non-autistic people. And the only time autistic people are included is either to evaluate the technology or to engage in a study around the technology, i.e. they're the research subjects. And I feel there's an ethical issue there that we need to think about. There's also some research that says including autistic users is really the essential component if we want to address some of these methodological problems that I identified in the talk today. And finally, the lack of relevance in VR research, particularly aligning VR research with the needs of the autistic community by including people in the community in the design of interventions, it's much more likely that we're going to be designing interventions that are going to align with those needs. The next piece, we need to think not only about the rigor of our work, but also the relevance of our work. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but I will say that there's a whole school of thought around this, where a guy, so the article, the Schmidt article that we put together back in 2013, talks about how we can think about issues related to scientific rigor while at the same time creating interventions that are relevant to the community, and how these can fit within Stokes' what he calls Pasteur's quadrant. And I would invite you to check out the literature on Pasteur's quadrant. But if you want to see a great example of a article and a research study that is both rigorous and relevant, I would point you to Dixon and colleagues' article on video-based virtual reality that was published in 2019, because it's not only an outstanding design, and not only does it establish generalization in a way that is very trustworthy and methodologically rigorous, but also they have done a fantastic job of across the whole board. So go read that article. It's good stuff. All right. I was going to talk about some examples from my own work, but I know I've gone over on my time. When I practiced this, I was a lot faster. So I apologize for that. If we have time, I'm happy to go into those examples, but if we don't, we can call it a moment and we can go into questions now. So I guess that's a question for the organizers.
Thank you, Matthew. I mean, I've got a couple of questions sent to me already, and we're going to start with the next bit at 4. So, I mean, how long do you reckon you'll be with your examples?
I tell you what we'll do. How about we just hop into directions for future research then, and I won't go into the examples.
Okay.
So this is just going to kind of sum it all up. If you want to know what I think we should do, I think we need to better differentiate and define different kinds of virtual reality and different kinds of virtual reality research. We need to think about the affordances of the technology. And in addition to that, I think that we need to embrace this notion of extended reality, that is the broader context within which virtual reality exists, and think not only in terms of a single technology direction, but also in terms of cross reality, augmented reality, mixed reality, and so on. I also think that we need to align VR affordances with our intervention outcomes. That is, we need to look at what the technology is capable of, what our intended outcomes are, and how those specific technology affordances are going to promote those outcomes, and then tweak them so that we can amplify the positive and hopefully, kind of suppress issues that might emerge, such as cyber sickness, for example. I also believe that we need to better align our interventions with the priorities of the autism community, as we talked about before, daily living and so on. We need to be thinking about theoretically informed design and publishing on our design so that we can establish a basis of precedent within the field. And finally, we need to do a much better job about validating the assumptions that are foundational to this field, such as generalization, but there are many others. So I think that just about covers it. That's my talk for the day. And on that note, I'll open up the floor for questions.
So thank you very much for that, Matthew. I think it's definitely a great way to start the event for the next few days, and I would say definitely provocative. Plenty to talk about, and just with your examples, say if you want to, you can share them on the Twitter. I'm sure we can then share those around for anyone who's interested, and then how your own work can apply to everything. So for the first question that I got in the chat, so if anyone wants to ask a question, either message me, so Elliot Millington, privately, or just put it into the general chat to everyone. We should be able to get around to all of them. So the first one is thinking about VR sickness or cyber sickness. So participants can sometimes be uncomfortable and will have to withdraw. So this person was just wondering how often you and your participants have experienced cyber sickness in your research, and then how that affects dropout rates and your general findings.
Yeah, so I guess there's 3 things I can point to there. I've experienced it in every single research study that I've done, whether it was desktop-based or head-mounted display-based. And we've had to control for that. And we actually just released an article in Frontiers in Virtual Reality that provides a process model for how you too can control for that in your own implementations. And I'll grab the link for that and paste that into the chat in just a bit. But how it affects dropout rates, I think it depends. So we had one student who was severely impacted by autism, who we had a hard time getting that student to return to the computer and to continue with the intervention. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the person who was sitting next to that particular participant and the participant in order to keep them at the computer and keep them engaged. And so that was working with adolescents. Working with adults, it's actually been the opposite. Despite their sensations of cyber sickness, they have wanted to continue. They found the technology to be appealing and to be engaging and motivating. And so they wanted to do it. In fact, the one participant that we had in my most recent study had the most profound experiences of cyber sickness asked to come back and do a second round of research with us because he liked it so much. So I don't know if we have any definitive answers about how that affects attrition, for example, but certainly it does manifest. And in my own experience, it's manifested every time. It's something that we have to be aware of and we have to control for.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So Tammy, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yes, I just have a question about your where you mentioned that real world versus VR, that it could translate, the responses could translate to real life. I just wanted to know that what you think, whether the fear of making a mistake is gone in virtual reality and whether this might affect people's responses. I just wanted to know a bit more of your thoughts on whether it's actually representative of real life or not.
Well, there's a whole body of literature around how people perceive VR and how nobody thinks that it's real life, right? We all know fundamentally on a cognitive level that this is not real life. And yet the level of immersion that the technology provides, particularly now, it kind of tricks our senses into eliciting true psychological responses that are identical to what we would see in the real world. And examples of that would be, for example, having people walk along a precipice, right? A cliff in virtual reality, and you know their pulse increases, the sweat on their body increases, and so on, right? There is a physiological response to that when you know it's fake, right? So whether people feel like they're safer in terms of their responses and so on, some of the early work on the AS Interactive project showed that people with autism would behave in the virtual environment in ways that they knew were inappropriate to the real world. And they said it's because it's a virtual environment, right? It's not the real world, so we can do this, right? So so yes, there are going to be differences in how people behave in the virtual environment, but I also think that it's a question of how you're going to define the behavior and what it is that you want to focus, what it is that you want to target. If you're focusing on social skills and social behaviors in a virtual environment, in the real world, it's inappropriate to walk into someone or to stand 2 inches away from them. But how many times have you been in a multi-user virtual environment where someone has walked through you or their avatar has overlapped with yours, right? You can't really necessarily draw a direct distinction between what's happening in virtual environments and the real world, which is one of the reasons that I feel daily living skills may be more appropriate in these environments, in that you can provide these simulations that are risk-free. For example, in some of the work that we did public transportation training, right? You don't want to get hit by a bus when you're doing public transportation training, so doing it in a virtual environment is much safer. And then what we find is if you're able to do the activities in the exact same way that you would do them in the real world, they actually do transfer, but you have to be really careful about how you design it. You have to design it specifically to promote transfer. You can't just hope that it's going to happen. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Okay. I hope that answered your question.
Yep, that answered my question. Thank you very much.
You bet.
So, and I think we have time for one more question here. David Simmons, you want to ask?
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, Matthew. That was a really interesting talk, and as Elliot said, a great way to start the conference. I'm just interested a bit more in these single subject designs that you're talking about, because it's a big frustration in the field, not just in autism and VR, but really autism research in general, that most of it really only demonstrates that autism is a heterogeneous condition and not much else. And I'm really drawn to the idea that we need to look in depth with maybe a smaller number of participants, well, not participants, a smaller number of co-researchers really, to explore what we can do with virtual reality. And I just wondered what your, if you could maybe give an example or two of your single subject approach and how you've implemented that.
Yeah, so again, I'll share a paper with you guys about that. It's the Schmidt 2013 paper, which looked at evidence-based practices in special education. And I was kind of able to fit in some of the work around rigor and relevance and design-based research and Pasteur's quadrant, things of that nature in that work. And one of the arguments I made in that piece is that single subject design is actually particularly well suited for that kind of research, in that single subject design, the intent of it is not to generalize, right? It's not like we're trying to say that this work generalizes to the entire population. What it does do is it shows with extreme rigor that your intervention works, within a specific context, within a specific population, right? That's really where we need to start focusing instead, in my view, because this notion that we need to do randomized control trials with large N, I feel like that's wishful thinking at best, and trying to, first of all, design, but also to execute those studies and then to do follow-ups on those studies, time-consuming, difficult, massive amounts of attrition, expensive. I mean, I could go on. So when we think about the appropriate kinds of research that we can be doing, and how we can be increasing rigor within this frame, yeah, single subject seems to be an approach that we can look at. What are we going to be able to say as a result of that? Well, I don't think we're going to be able to say VR works, but I think that what we will be able to say is, I designed a 360-degree video-based virtual reality intervention for street crossing. I used a variety of heuristics to promote generalization. I tested it in the virtual world. I tested it in the real world. Here are my test results. It seems like this particular design, where I've instantiated this particular intervention, works within this particular context. And that then provides precedent, evidence-based precedent, for the next designer to come along and say, I can draw from that within my own implementation context.
Excellent, thank you.
So I think we can one more, Cleona Kelly, if you've raised your hand deliberately and if you want to ask away.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. Definitely some thought-provoking points that you've raised as well. One of the points that you did raise, which I've kind of been thinking about since beginning my research, is having more of a focus on the positive aspects of autism and moving away from this kind of negative view of what's wrong, how can we fix? And I was wondering what your experience was in applying for funding with research focused in this way, or if anybody else within the Zoom has applied for research in the for funding in this way, their experiences around it, because like my initial thoughts can, I'm assuming, and just based on how a lot of funders work, is that this might be a bit of a difficult push for us, but is definitely something that I hope as a community we can definitely work towards.
Yeah, you just asked the real question, and my experience has been unsuccessful, quite frankly. And, you know, in the abstract for this talk, I said that the directions I was going to present are paradigmatically divergent from the dominating research discourse in this area. And that's the reason that funding is not following, is because it is so divergent. And I think that, you know, if we want to be successful with attaining funding, what needs to happen is we need to be able to align the methods and processes that we will implement within kind of the worldviews and the research paradigms that are valued by funding agencies. So in other words, speaking to rigor, speaking to effective intervention, speaking to outcomes, and speaking to funding priorities, while at the same time understanding that the methods and processes that you will engage in specifically as a researcher are going to be a bit different. For example, you know, engaging in formative design, engaging users in user experience design processes, usability studies, and so on, so as to attune the intervention to your particular population in your particular context, so as to provide a greater probability that your intervention is going to be successful, right? Those are some of the things that funders are not necessarily interested in. However, things are changing, and for example, the NIH, National Institutes of Health in the United States, is now beginning to be more open to these, they would frame it as participatory community-based action research. So that would be, you know, something you would want to wrap your work within a participatory community-based action research framework to show that you're doing focus groups and interviews and front-end analysis before you go into the actual execution of the study. So there's hope. There's hope on the horizon, and I continue to, you know, chip away at that rock. But you know, funding can be capricious as well. So it's just a matter of getting lucky, right?
So thank you so much for that, Matthew. I think I might have to cut it short there.